Let's get down to the latest developments. And one of them is that the governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, who was seen by some as a front runner to be the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Kamala Harris as her running mate, has withdrawn. Uh, Steve Reed, what do you make of that?
Well, I think Governor Cooper has been a fantastic leader for the state of North Carolina. He's pushed through some major initiatives, expanding Medicaid as well as others. For him to take his name out, I'm sure, I think, according to his statement, he didn't think the timing was right for himself and the state of North Carolina and the vice president's campaign. I think it's important for us to understand that the vice president is under a very tight timeline to name her own vice president in this case. Normally this would be going on for months. Her team is doing this in weeks. And so that can cause some challenges, I'm sure, for any of the potential VP candidates.
Does it mean that Democrats can forget about winning North Carolina?
Well, North Carolina, like the race itself, is going to be a very, very close race. I don't think that now is the time. I think it's too early to say whether or not you should give up on a state like North Carolina. This is going to be a close race. It's going to come down to who gets out their base and who can motivate voters to the polls. And so the vice president knows that she's an underdog right now, and I think that we're going to compete in every state that's possible to compete in.
Katie, if you were advising the Democrats, who is the vice presidential candidate that you think the Trump campaign would have most cause to fear?
Well, my advice to the Democratic Party would have been to have an actual presidential primary so that Vice President Harris could have won the votes and the delegates instead of President Biden stepping aside. Because historically, a presidential primary is an excellent opportunity to vet a potential vice presidential pick. If you look historically in the Democratic Party, in the last 30 years, only 2 of their vice presidential picks had not run for president themselves. Vice President Harris ran against President Biden. President Biden ran against President Obama, and so forth. The only 2 people who weren't actual candidates for president themselves were Tim Kaine, Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016, and then Joe Lieberman, Al Gore's running mate in 2000. So of all the potential contenders out there, with the exception of Secretary Pete Buttigieg, no one has been under the scrutiny of a national campaign. So you'll have someone like, say, Mark Kelly, who looks like an excellent candidate on paper, but he hasn't been vetted on the national stage. And there are going to be some things in his record and in his business dealings that could cause some serious concern. So my advice to the Democratic Party would have been vet them better.
I mean, I appreciate your point, but the same goes for J.D. Vance. He hasn't fought a national campaign before either.
He hasn't run a national campaign, but he has, of course, received a lot of attention through his New York Times bestselling autobiography, through the film made about his life. He has been a little bit more on the national stage than some other people. And in the Republican Party, there is less of a historical precedent of choosing someone who's run for president as your running mate.
I've got to put to you, I just wonder what you make of Professor Alan Lichtman, who has this theory predicting who's going to win the presidency. And he was saying that he thought it was a done deal for Donald Trump. But since these changes, he's now saying his keys point to the fact that it's likely to be Kamala Harris.
Well, it is 98 days, and it has been probably the longest month, I would say, in American politics recently. When you and I spoke 2 weeks ago, President Trump had just 48 hours ago survived an assassination attempt, and President Biden was the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. Now we're in an entirely different political landscape, so I would not be making any predictions right now. I joke that 2016 cured me of ever making a political prediction. But I think that President Trump, since earlier, this is going to be a base election. It's going to be who motivates their base, who turns them out the best. And I'll tell you, the organization and the ground game we are seeing from the Trump campaign is light years ahead of where they were in 16 and 20. I was at the RNC the entire week, and it was my 3rd convention. I've never been to a convention that was as optimistic and enthusiastic as that one.
Stephen, is that your impression that the Trump campaign's much better in your part of the country in Alabama this year?
No, that's not my impression. I think that Vice President Harris inherits a robust field operation, one that is poised to go on the ground not only in swing states but other states to compete at the top and in down ballot races. I think that we've seen over 170,000 people sign up in the last week alone to be volunteers. We've seen again a record in terms of fundraising coming from well over 60% of first-time donors, accumulating over $200 million just in 8 days. There's a lot of energy and excitement on behalf of the vice president because I believe she has the right message and she has the right momentum to win this race. Now, again, she also is faring very well, not only in the base vote, but I think it's important to understand that 7% of independents, she is poised to consolidate those voters to her side because of her agenda for the future, not one that's taking us back to the past, threatening reproductive rights of women and other rights that have been gained over these last several decades. So I think that is really leading the enthusiasm among young voters, white college educated voters, African American, Latino, and Asian American Pacific Islander voters. We're seeing those key segments. And again, those independents in those swing states, that 7%, she is very poised to consolidate that vote. And I think when you consider the ground game that's already been built through the Biden-Harris infrastructure that she will inherit over these next several months, I think that we'll see a robust ground game.
Katie, do you think that Donald Trump would have gone along with J.D. Vance as his running mate if he'd known that he would be facing Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket? Because, those issues concerning women do seem to have very much come to the fore.
Well, that's an excellent point. I'll just say to Steve's point, we're just going back for one moment here. I would caution my friends in the Democratic Party to be too optimistic. This is still the honeymoon phase of the vice president's candidacy for the presidency. And when she first announced she was running for president in 2019, she got off to a great start with a lot of enthusiasm, and it quickly went downhill from there. So I would just caution them to not get too enthusiastic when it's just the honeymoon phase. As far as who President Trump would have selected if he had known the Vice President Harris would be the nominee, I cannot get inside the mind of Donald Trump. I can't say to that. But, I believe when you look at why he chose J.D. Vance, it was very clear because he was looking to send a message for the future, and he wanted a younger generation. At the time when President Biden was the nominee, President Biden was elected to the Senate 12 years before J.D. Vance was even born. So he is J.D. Vance of my generation. He is a millennial, and he's going to be the third youngest vice president in history. So it is a very significant thing to look on to the next generation. I know President Biden mentioned that in his Oval Office address. So I believe that is something that definitely factored in to President Trump's decision of selecting Vance.
Okay. And Stephen, just finally, when do you think we are going to find out who Kamala Harris's running mate's going to be?
Well, the vice president and her election team have stated by August the 7th, they will name vice president, and whoever they name, I believe will be someone who adds a lot more to the ticket than what J.D. Vance does for the former president. I think that she will add someone who she has a relationship with, certainly someone that she believes can lead if called upon, and someone that will help her govern. So those will be, I think the things that the team is looking at, and given the short list that I'm sure we've all seen, I think all of those men are capable of doing that.
Katie Frost and Stephen Reed, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.